My name is Solsiree del Moral. I'm an associate professor of American Studies, Black Studies, and Latin American Studies at Amherst College. I am presenting, Manuel asked me to present on a recent article that I published in the Radical History Review, which is just a brief article that is intended to, it's in this black journal here. The Radical History Review had an issue focused just on Puerto Rico, and the majority of the articles in the journal were oral interviews, histories and testimonials of nationalist leaders. And so it was edited by Margaret Power, who was a historian of the nationalist movements in Puerto Rico. So I, along with another historian, was asked just to, she said, guess what? People don't have a basic history of Puerto Rico, or don't know where to go if they want to know a basic, how do I get into the history of Puerto Rico? And so she asked me and somebody else to write a very short essay, 5 books. How would you introduce someone to the history of Puerto Rico? So that's what I'm going to present here. I'm sure that many of you in the room know more than I do. And so I defer to you. I'm here to share my perspective, but I don't assume that I know more than anybody else here. I'm looking at some of you who I know and who I know should be here instead of me, but here I am. So the article asked specifically for a discussion of books to introduce you to the modern history of Puerto Rico. And what I wanted to say is that the modern history of Puerto Rico, for non-specialists, for us in Latin American and Caribbean history, specifically means 19th and 20th century history, which means that the history books that I'm going to suggest to you today are from the 19th and 20th centuries, and they're intended to introduce the history of the island to non-specialists. Now, non-specialists can mean historians not of Puerto Rico or scholars of Puerto Rican studies who are not focused on history, or anybody else who's interested in any aspect of Puerto Rican history. So it's for non-specialists. We can go as deep or as superficial as you want. Just let me know as we move along. So as we know, maybe we don't know, but the Puerto Rican scholarship is vast, it's deep, it's engaged and complex and beautiful. And our authors have published in English and Spanish, and some of us know that our literary authors, poets, and novelists publish proudly in Spanglish. Now, I, chose to focus on books that were published in English. That excludes, 70% of the scholarship. But the intention was that it was for non-specialists reading in a US journal, so no Spanish knowledge is required, number one. But the second is intentional in that the audience is also the Puerto Ricans of the United States who have been here for generations. And of course, monolingualism is no reason to be excluded from the scholarship of your country of origin. So these are English language sources, but we have and can discuss many of them in Spanish as well. So I chose 19th and 20th century texts, English, Spanish, and Spanglish, and my choice was to include historical works that were inclusive of the island and the diaspora. So what do I mean by that? Puerto Rican identities, as we all might know in the room, are very clear about boundaries. You're from where? You're from where? How long? What language? So that is reproduced in historical scholarship, and so I could have chosen histories of Puerto Rico that pretend that half of the population does not live in the US. I could have chosen historical studies of Puerto Ricans in the US that don't look at the migration and the back and forth. So I intentionally chose texts, which means that I can't include everything, but I chose texts that define slowly over time, as we move forward into the 20th century, the Puerto Rican nation, in quotes, as a transnational space that's trying as best as possible to incorporate both the island history and the mainland history, and the movement between both. Okay, let's see. So I chose books like that. Let's see, history inclusive of island. My paper fell, let me just take a second. Okay. So, in addition, choices, my choice and the choice of somebody else might be different, was to focus on texts that highlighted, did not neglect, but for highlighted questions about race, gender, and class in the formation of Puerto Rican history and Puerto Rican identities. As we may or may not know, there's something called the new social history that emerged in the 1970s, maybe before half of us in the room were born. But the new social history was very mindful of not reproducing histories of Puerto Rico, or in whatever country of origin the scholarship was grounded in, But it was very mindful of not producing history that was elitist and only male-centered and only white. So there's different ways that this Puerto Rican scholarship since the 19th centuries has been very mindful of class differences, not so much of gender differences, but we will discuss that today, and very recently of racial differences. So I've chosen texts that try to do that as best possible. Okay. I talk fast, I can hear my ticky as I'm going. Okay, and the last thing is that for non-specialists, one of the arguments that I make in the essay and that I'll make today is that if Puerto Rico is a case study, if you're first entering a study of Puerto Rico, then that means you're also doing a study of colonialism, of modern forms of colonialism, and very specifically of the US as an empire. It's also, Spanish Empire, but it's US empire. And so I would argue that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to try to do a historical study of the island in the 19th and 20th century without being mindful of our superstructure of colonialism and imperialism. So these texts try somehow to cover some of that information. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just sketch very briefly 3 different historical periods and the books that I recommend for each of these historical periods. And then I'll make some concluding remarks. And I think we can, as a group, you can think about any questions that you have about the historical periods or any questions that you have about the text I have chosen to represent that historical period, okay? So, the 3 historical periods are the long 19th century, which I'll explain, the first half of the 20th century, and the post-World War II era. These are vast and huge, but I'm oversimplifying, obviously. Okay. So, I just wanted to give you some characteristics of the long 19th century before I explain the text that I have chosen, okay? So, we may or may not know, but the long 19th century in Puerto Rico, well, let me just say first that in most Latin American and Caribbean countries, the 19th century marks the moment of political independence from Spain. We don't have that in early 20th century Puerto Rico, but we have other economic and political factors at that time that mark a transition to modern history, okay? So, so the first thing that we have in 1815 is that Spain, as we may or may not know, Spain loses all of its colonies in the Americas between 1808 and 1822, except Puerto Rico and Cuba. And as a consequence, Spain has to reevaluate its colonialism, its version of economic and political colonialism. And as of 1815, Puerto Rico and Cuba are more economically expansive as colonies. Okay? So that economic expansion means that Puerto Rico, like Cuba, sees an expansion in the sugar industry. Okay? That becomes the main industry of the first half of the 19th century. The sugar industry in the Caribbean, we should always know, equals slavery. So while we have a rise in the sugar industry in Puerto Rico, we also have a great increase in the population of Africans and African-descended slaves who came either from the African continent or other Caribbean and Latin American countries. So while we had different racial groups on the island before then, it's in the 19th century that we have a sudden growth. Okay. This cannot move any faster. If you're a historian, te duele, it's going too fast. But in the second half of the 19th century, we have the rise of sugar, and then we have the decline, and then we have the rise of coffee. And many people are familiar with the rise of coffee and the culture that emerges, the Creole culture that emerges in the highlands of the coffee. But many of the Puerto Rican scholarship is particularly focused on the horrific working conditions of coffee workers in the highlands. It's a very romanticized period in the national myth, but it was a very difficult and hard moment. And so the scholarship focuses on that. In the late 19th century, we have the decline of Spanish colonial authority. We have Cuba undergoing a series of revolutions, Spain trying desperately to hold on to Puerto Rico. It's very, very repressive, and it loses authority over the island at the same time that Puerto Ricans are developing Creole and nationalist identities. Okay. That's a lot of information. This is the long 19th century, but it's a specific moment in Puerto Rican history. So the 2 books that Decline of Colonial. Well, obviously, we have the War of 1898, where the US enters the island and occupies, and then we have the early 20th century, 1910s, 1920s, as a period of US colonialism where our political actors on the island have to shift their alliances. Okay, so the point of all of this is to say that the books I have chosen, and if you want a copy of the slide, I can just let me know and I'm happy to send it to you. I know I'm going way too fast because I want to get here. So the 2 books that I've chosen, again, anybody in the room could have chosen different texts. But the two books, if you've read nothing on 19th century Puerto Rico, that I recommend are Eileen Finley's Imposing Decency, published in the year 2000, and Ileana Rodriguez Silva's book called Silencing Race, subtitled Disentangling Blackness, Colonialism, and National Identities in Puerto Rico. Okay, so what can I tell you about these books? Very quickly. Eileen Finley's book, Imposing Decency, The Politics of Sexuality and Race in Puerto Rico, 1870 to 1930. While it says it starts in 1870, it really is a book that introduces us to the history that I've just been outlining for you. But it does it very specifically through an understanding of the question of the patriarchal family in Puerto Rico, la gran familia puertorriqueña, and all the different people and members of the gran familia puertorriqueña. She focuses primarily on the question of honor, how all members of this gran familia had honor, defined their honor. And then she has a special case studies on working women in Puerto Rico. So the book introduces you to the larger arguments that I presented, but more specifically, Eileen Finley has a focus on the politics of sexuality and gender, primarily from non-elite women, and she's very conscious of how race, gender, and sexuality are all intertwined. I teach this book, I've been teaching it as long as I've been teaching, which is about 10 years now, and it's a really good introduction for many people to the identity politics of race, gender, and class in Puerto Rico. So don't be put off by the fact that it's a 19th century book. In many ways, it's very contemporary. Okay. The second book that I recommend for this time period is Ileana Rodriguez Silva's Silencing Race. So Ileana's looking at the same period as Eileen Finley, but she's looking first and foremost at the question of blackness. Her goal and her intention is to demolish the assumption, and we can debate this here, of course, that in Puerto Rico there is a long history of racial harmony. That's a very significant national myth, which is tied to the other myth of cultural nationalism. We can discuss that more at length. But that is a post-1940s, 1950s construction. And before then, there were very explicit discussions about race in Puerto Rico. You will be reminded that slavery in Puerto Rico existed until 1873. So when we have African descendant peoples, Black Puerto Ricans, at the turn of the century, Black Puerto Ricans are the leadership of artisan groups in the urban cities. They are unionized, and they're part of a really significant intellectual community. So the question of blackness is always present in conversation about labor and class in Puerto Rico at the turn of the century, our author argues. But we pretend that it's not, right? So she calls it a conspiracy of silence around blackness and race. And so what she looks at is moments of rupture. When there's a crisis, when there's a debate, when there's an argument, what you thought was a silence allows for an opening when people start to insult and claim whiteness or blackness. And so it is in those moments of rupture when the speakers engage in explicit discussion of race, that's what our author looks at, and it helps to understand how race functions in Puerto Rico. Okay, so these are the two texts that I recommend for the 19th century. I'm moving quickly because Manuel said 30 minutes. Okay. Okay, I can answer any questions you have about this at any time. There's tons of beautiful, wonderful literature in the 19th century. We have Luis Figueroa. We have a whole history that emerged in the 1970s on comparative slavery. We have a new historiography on comparative empire in Puerto Rico. So there's lots and lots and lots of work in labor unionizing. But let's move forward. Okay, so moving forward, and I'm mindful that I'm using a laptop without a cord, so it might go out at any minute. So just FYI. So what are some of the characteristics of the first half of the 20th century in Puerto Rico? Again, you may be aware with some of these. The first half, I put 1898 because we have the Cuban War of Independence that began in the 1890s. The United States invades in the Cuban War, and as a second thought, says we'll take Puerto Rico as well. So the United States invades Puerto Rico, occupies the island as we know, and has never left officially. Puerto Rico remains a colonial territory of the island. In 1900, you may know Puerto Rico had what is called the 4-Acre Act, which is when the US Congress approved the first constitution for Puerto Rico. This is the moment that the US Congress says, yes, we are an empire, yes, we have legal authority to provide a constitution for Puerto Rico. whether or not Puerto Ricans accept it. So this is like a really significant moment in the definition of colonialism in Puerto Rico. Moving forward to 1917, we have what is called the the Jones Act. The Jones Act renegotiated some of the terms of the 4-Acre Act. It further inscribed colonialism in Puerto Rico, especially because it was accompanied by the granting of U.S. citizenship to all Puerto Ricans born on the island. That was a choice of the U.S. Congress. Okay. Then, in the 1910s and 1930s, we have, Puerto Rico is known as, along with Cuba, the eastern part of the Dominican Republic, as America's sugar empire. Puerto Rico goes through a period of economic growth for large-scale and mid-sized sugar plantations. So it's bounty for the sugar plantation owners, both Puerto Rican elites and U.S. Americans. It is hardship for the majority of sugarcane workers. Many have lost land with the expansion of sugar. Sugarcane work is not easy. It's a job where you suffer. But sugarcane workers in Puerto Rico have a long tradition of union organizing and labor organizing. So in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s are the years that we say the sugarcane burnt, right? Because the sugarcane workers were unionizing. And they were seeking leadership and collaborating with the Socialist Party in Puerto Rico. This was an opportunity and a historical moment when the workers were working alongside the Socialist Party. It's also a missed opportunity, historians say, when the Socialist Party, which had the majority of worker support, could have formed much longer and stronger alliances with the Nationalist Party. Most of us in the US are familiar with the Nationalist Party, with the history of Albizu Campos in the 1930s and 1940s, etc. Albizu, who is a hero to many, at that time, it was an intellectual. His language, his speech, his theoretical speeches about capitalism and the bourgeois were not connecting with the sugarcane workers. And so historians see this as a missed opportunity. Okay, lots of information for the first half of the 20th century. The book that I chose to help exemplify some of the characteristics that I've mentioned is called, you might be familiar or not, it's called Worker in the Cane. It was originally published by Sidney Mintz. Sidney Mintz is an anthropologist who I think passed away recently. He spent a lifetime working on the Caribbean, specifically on Puerto Rico, Haiti, and Jamaica. In 1960, or in the late 1950s, he, on the island, and he's a controversial figure for many reasons, and we can discuss that as well. But he published a book called Worker in the Cane, A Puerto Rican Life History. And it's really a testimonial of an individual named Don Tasso. Let me give you his full name. Anastasio Saya Alvarado, known as Don Tasso, and his wife, Doña Eli, Elizabeth Villaronga Colón de Sayas. Okay, so the anthropologist Mintz befriends a sugarcane worker who is a father, who is a husband, who is interested, who's a skilled worker in the sugarcane industry, who's interested in politics, who's engaged in politics, who is disillusioned by the corruption of politicians, and eventually, later in his life, converts to Pentecostalism. And so the book is a testimony of the life of the sugarcane worker in the first half of the 20th century, and his wife, with the interventions of an anthropologist. But for students of Puerto Rican history, it gives you the language. And what you read about is the honor, you read about the childhood of the working poor in Puerto Rico. You read about the courtship and the love between Don Tasso and Doña Eli. You read about how carefully they nurtured their children, their many children, who suffered many hardships in the early 20th century, but how these parents and their community in their barrio went out of their way to find whatever medication was available, whatever school was available, to nurture and protect their kids as best they could. Nevertheless, unfortunately, Doña Eli and Don Tasso lose children, as many working people did in the early 20th century, due to disease and other things. One of the gifts of the book is that it gives a lot of information about the sugar industry itself. If you're from the coast, if you have a family who has memories of the sugar industry, it has lots of discussion of the production of sugar, the instruments used in sugar, the processing of sugar, the mechanization of sugar, that really de-skilled the worker instead of empowered the worker. So it's fascinating for many reasons. And what it allows is for an understanding of the first half of the 20th century from the perspective of a worker. Okay. So the book, Worker in the Cane, has been published many, many times, but it was translated and published in Spanish by Ediciones Huracán, and it's called Tazo, Trabajador de la Caña. So if you want to read it in Spanish, it's available in Spanish. If you want to read it in English, it's available in English. We can discuss it more. We can discuss the politics of production behind the book, but I'm going to keep going because I have about 10 more minutes. Okay. So this is a ginormous historical category. We'll just call it the post-World War II era. Within it, there's many, many, many divisions, but in order to synthesize, let me just mention, and there's kind of a lot here, let me just mention some of the main characteristics. So, the post-World War era, 1940s and forward, was a moment of economic reconstruction in Puerto Rico, first of all, right? It's the economic reconstruction and restructure from the 1930s. That economic reconstruction is led by a new political party that's founded in the late 1938, becomes popular in the 1940s, called the Partido Popular Democrático, the PPD. These are technocrats and bureaucrats who are invested in the native economy, but are always connected to the United States as a larger economy. Initially, these technocrats and bureaucrats support, this is very similar to the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean, what is called import substitution agriculture. So for Puerto Rico's economy to regenerate, it should be able to produce, in terms of agriculture, the goods that it imports. It's going to substitute what it imports and produce it in Puerto Rico. It should also be able to have some level of manufacturing and industry on the island that allows Puerto Rico to produce articles that it need not import. Shoes, textiles, glass, cement factories for infrastructure, etc. So this is a period of rapid economic growth. It's also known as Operation Bootstrap. This is an economic project where people were asked to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get to work, rebuild the economy, go to the industry, go to factories, okay? Which meant that the government abandons agriculture and supports industrialization, okay? This matters because Puerto Rico was primarily an agricultural country. But there's a rapid kind of abandonment of agriculture, support for industrialization. That means loss of jobs in rural areas, some new jobs in the cities. So the people in the rural areas who lose their jobs have to feed their families. They move to the cities looking for employment. There's this promise, according to the government, that Operation Bootstrap is going to provide all of us with factory jobs. Let's move, let's go to it. But in fact, there are a limited number of jobs that are offered in the industrialization process. Many individuals who move to the cities find smaller number of jobs available than they expected, so they become unemployed. They also find that cities are not able to accommodate them in terms of housing, education, and healthcare. No problem. We have a crisis, but the Puerto Rican government says, don't worry about it. We will form an alliance with US private corporations and help this surplus population, as it was called at the time, leave the island. Puerto Ricans are workers, if nothing else. So between 1945 and 1965, with the explicit support of the Puerto Rican government and alliances with private corporations in the United States, 25% of the island's population left. Those are our ancestors if we are of Puerto Rican heritage and maybe second or third generation in the US. They went to New York to work in factories. They went to Eastern Connecticut and Western Massachusetts to work in tobacco. They went to Eastern Pennsylvania to pick mushrooms. They went to Ohio. They went to Michigan. They went to the steel mills of Pittsburgh, et cetera, et cetera. They went to Chicago as domestics. So that's a huge thing. 25% is known as the Great Migration. Some of those who left the island because of the economic situation stayed. It was a permanent migration. They never returned to Puerto Rico. Some of them came as temporary workers. They came with a contract, seasonal labor, and then they went back to Puerto Rico with the earnings that they had. Some of them came to Puerto Rico, they started in New York, but they ended up in Ohio, or they moved to Chicago, or they moved to Michigan, or they were in the military and they went all the way to California, or they went to Texas. And some of them created a life where locally they were grounded, but they maintained family connections, employment, and education in what is called a transnational experience. There's mobility and an awareness of the island and the US, okay? That is all to say that this is when the historical reality of Puerto Rico, which is migration, movement, displacement, reconstituting families and communities in the US, clashes violently with what many of us might understand to be the national narrative of Puerto Rico. If you leave the island like a coquille, you are disintegrated. Puerto Ricans are from the island. We speak Spanish. We're Catholic. We're not Americans. We don't speak English. We are tied to the land. We are patriarchal. And we are racially harmonious. And anybody who challenges that is obviously challenging an understanding of Puerto Rican identity. That's a really kind of romantic interpretation of Puerto Rican national identity that has protected many people who suffered through migration in the 1940s and 1950s. But in fact, it really goes against the historical reality of migration and displacement and the dynamic communities that are born in the United States, okay? So Operation Serenity is the educational project that promotes through schools the idea of Puerto Ricans as racially harmonious and united. Okay. And cultural nationalism is what emerges in the 1940s and 1950s. Once the political party, the Partido Popular Democrático, comes to power, and its leader, Muñoz Marín, negotiates with the US a new version of colonialism that we call Estado Libre Asociado, or Commonwealth status. And that promotes a cultural nationalism, right? A permanent connection to the United States, but culturally distinct and nationalist and unique, its own language, its own history, its own ideology, but not politically independent. That's why it's called cultural nationalism. So the idea of cultural nationalism and Operation Serenity went hand in hand, okay? And there might be a disjuncture here. We can discuss that some more. That is to say, that's a lot. Moving quickly. And the two books that I recommend to introduce us to some of the many topics that I've just mentioned are Juan Flores' Divided Borders from 1993. This is an old book now. And Jorge Duane's The Puerto Rican Nation from 2002. Now, you might be familiar with Juan Flores. He was kind of like the grandfather of Puerto Rican cultural studies in the United States. He's published many books for many years. He passed away a couple years ago. This is one of his earliest books, and it's really an essay, a collection of essays. And in it, Juan Flores takes on what I've just mentioned, the racial harmony and the cultural nationalism and the geographic boundaries of Puerto Rican identities. And he begins by taking on Puerto Rican intellectuals like Pedreira, who he identifies as Hispanophile and elitist, who have failed to understand the contribution of the majority of non-elite Black and brown Puerto Ricans or popular culture. He moves on to critique the literature of another renowned Puerto Rican, Juan Luis Gonzalez, who has a book called The Four-Storied Country, or El País de Cuatro Pisos. And Juan Flores says this is a beautiful book. I am so happy that Gonzalez has included Black people in the history of Puerto Rico. This is, again, one of the first people to do that explicitly. But Juan Flores says, you forgot the diaspora. So I would add one more floor. In addition to the cultural mixture that you're explaining, do not ignore from your understanding of Puerto Rican history the 25% of the population that was forced to leave the island in seeking employment, okay? And then he moves forward to the 1980s, 1990s, and he examines Spanglish authors, like I mentioned earlier, like Tato Laviera, who are the generation who grew up in the 1970s in New York and really experienced some tremendous backlash and discrimination, both from the New York community, and then when they romanticized and went back to Puerto Rico, speaking as Spanglish, faced a lot of discrimination from the Puerto Rican community in the island. And so there's a new generation of scholars that emerge in a period known as Nuyorican poetry that says, wait a minute, I'm Puerto Rican, but I'm from the diaspora, but I'm connected, but I'm rejected. So Juan Flores is exploring that from a literary perspective, okay? And his center is popular culture and working class. Okay, now, before Juan Flores, it was very hard to say, I'm from the diaspora, but I'm part of Puerto Rican history. Juan Flores took care of that conversation. But Jorge Duane really cemented it. He has a book called The Puerto Rican Nation on the Move. It's about what he calls el vaivén of the Puerto Rican, who moves back and forth, not continuously, but as necessary. And so it's a 20th century study of cultural and political identities in Puerto Rico, but what he says from the very beginning and to the end, just know that Puerto Rico, because of its mobility, number one, and because of its colonial status, yet heightened cultural nationalism, really challenges foundational definitions of nationalism. Puerto Rico is special. And so what we need to do is not think of it as exceptional. We need to re-evaluate what we think a nation is, he says. And from now on, in this book, when I say the Puerto Rican nation, know that I'm talking about the nation in its two parts, the island and the diaspora, right? And so he's moving forward from the conversation. He's like, I'm not having authenticity debates about this, if you are Puerto Rican enough or not. The historical reality is that half of the Puerto Ricans live on the island, half live in the United States, and I'm calling that the Puerto Rican nation. And so he does a study of race and identity and politics and empire and colonialism throughout the 20th century. And he's an anthropologist, so he's looking at material culture, museums, intellectuals, census records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he does a really, it's a collection of essays on a varied topics, but at this point in the literature of the 20th century, he's redefining Puerto Rican nation. Okay. Now, everything that I've said actually is pretty specific, even though for me, I think it's an entry point into Puerto Rican studies or Puerto Rican history. So in the essay, in the Black Book, in the essay, I also recommend some textbooks that I like, but somebody else might have chosen different textbooks. And so the first one is Edna Acosta Belén and Carlos Santiago's book, Puerto Ricans in the United States from 2006. It's been published more than once. It has a tremendous amount of statistical history in terms of the geographic movement and mobility and social class of Puerto Ricans in the US. But it does a really good job of trying to incorporate island history in the Puerto Rican history in the US. It does its best. Likewise, there's an excellent, these are again English language books, there's lots in Spanish. So Cesar Ayala and Rafael Bernabé have a book called Puerto Rico in the American Century, published in 2007. What's special about this book, it's a 20th century history book of Puerto Rico, but they don't reproduce traditional stories. They kind of rewrite the narrative. They try as best they can, it's really island-centered, but they try as best they can to incorporate the diaspora and new research. So my point is, it's impossible to do both well, so read both books, or continue to read books that focus on the US, books that focus on Puerto Rico. There's not one book that can encompass such a heterogeneous experience. Okay, my concluding remarks that I'm gonna say in 2 minutes or less is that I, as a Puerto Rican historian, walk around saying Puerto Rico is the center of the world, Puerto Rican scholarship is the most dynamic, Puerto Rico has a lot to teach everybody about workers in colonial society. So Puerto Rican history is really also a history that introduces non-specialists to the history of workers in colonial societies, be it Puerto Rico or be it any other, right? Workers and working poor and their conditions. Puerto Rico is a case study of race, class, and gender. You cannot pretend to tell the history of any Puerto Rican without understanding their family history, the gendered history, gendered roles, patriarchy, racial understandings, colorism, hierarchy, discrimination, and class. The aspirations of the middle class in the 1950s, but the majority of the working class in Puerto Rico. I also say, of course, one of Duane's main points and one of the examples of Puerto Rican history is political colonialism, cultural nationalism. Enduring ideologies, no one carries their flag more proudly than Puerto Ricans. How do we explain that considering the lack of political sovereignty? For some people, that's an ideological debate, which we can engage in. For historians, it becomes a historical fact. It's just based on record. And so we're much more dispassionate about it, but we can discuss it in the group as well. Finally, Puerto Rico is a study of migration, diaspora, and national histories. Migration the island itself is composed of no one who was there at one time. It is an island composed of different peoples who came at different times for different reasons. It has gone through tremendous changes. Puerto Ricans have been leaving the island as workers since the late 19th century, and obviously continue to do so today, as many of us know, especially in Holyoke, who's a receiving city. Puerto Rico is a history of the diaspora, not just the island. And within the diaspora, we have tremendous diversity. And with the island and the diaspora, we still use the word nation. We still are understood as a national community. And so Puerto Rico is a case study for that. And so my concluding point in the essay is, while Puerto Ricans take for granted that the study of Puerto Rico is a study of colonialism, the biggest lesson that it can offer US historians and US scholars is that the 20th century is also a history of the United States as a modern empire. So just like Puerto Rico is not free of colonialism, the US is not free of its imperialism and its imperial histories. And so if no one wants to learn about Puerto Rico, that's the most simple thing that they can learn. They don't have to, but they must at least understand that the United States is an empire. Okay, 30 minutes. I heard the battery beeping. That's all I have. I'm happy to take your questions. Okay.
You had mentioned that Jorge Bonnie's Puerto Rican on the Move challenged the reader to redefine what it meant to have a nation. Does he offer anything in return?
Anything in return to whom?
The definition of what
Oh, yes. So there's traditional definitions of nation, which are based in Europe, European definitions. Sovereign territory, shared history and personality of a people, religion, language, and maybe a couple other things. So he says, because of the fundamental practice of migration in Puerto Rico, and because of the enduring colonialism, yet cultural nationalism, what Puerto Rico offers is a reevaluation of the term nation. It's an expansion of the term nation. So Puerto Ricans don't have to apologize for having a national identity, but they can be specific and say, I have a national identity as a diasporic person, and I'm mindful of the cultural nationalism. And so what Puerto Rico offers is a way to demand an expansion of that term. That's what I think he would argue, but it's a...
Could that definition be incorporated into other colonized nations?
Well, see, he makes a distinction between political nationalism and cultural nationalism. Historians cannot argue that Puerto Rico is not a colonial territory of the US. It's the legislation. So we don't have a debate about that as historians, I think. What we have a debate about is how you cultivate cultural nationalism or cultural ideas of self as a nation and sovereign culturally, while still being politically colonial. That's a spectacular phenomenon. It's really a contradiction, but it's not a happenstance. It was an intentional political project that was born in the 1940s and 1950s as part of the economic and political project of the PPD, right? So it's not like, oh, it just automatically happened. It was intentional. And it has been, well, the question for Duany is, how can this cultural nationalism endure in different cycles of the 20th century in spite of the lack of political sovereignty on the island? He doesn't say there should be political sovereignty. He doesn't say que pena that there's no political sovereignty. That's not his question. His question is how, in spite of that, you still have this kind of really strong culturally nationalist definition of what a Puerto Rican is. And he's not the only person to do it, but he's the most accessible, I think, to do it.
Those of us who might not understand the transition between, let's say, the Spaniards in Puerto Rico to the transition to the United States in Puerto Rico, would you explain it kind of like abandonment, an opportunist who came in and seized an opportunity? How would you explain that transition?
Okay.
How it happened from Spanish rule to the United States colonialism? Okay.
So I would say there's many different ways to explain this, okay? But let's make the assumption that we're going to put Puerto Rico in the center of the story, okay? And so we'll describe it from the Puerto Rican perspective. And I'm not going to cover everything, but Puerto Rico was a colony of Spain until 1898. Spain was an empire in decline. It had lost its vast Latin American colonies, and it was going to lose the Philippines as well. So Latin American nations are being born in the 19th century. So Puerto Ricans have a nationalist identity as well. Especially the coffee elite have a Creole nationalist understanding of themselves. Why are we colonial when they're independent? So while Spain is in decline, for economic reasons, it cannot really consume the sugar that Puerto Rico is producing or the coffee that Puerto Rico is consuming. It's in decline as a political power and as an economic power. Therefore, it's not very effective as an empire, right? The Puerto Rican businessmen turn their attention to the United States as a market. So the United States starts consuming Puerto Rican coffee and sugar, okay? So there's already a relationship between Puerto Rico and the US. Okay, Puerto Rico's in the middle. At this time, the United States is industrializing. It needs sugar to produce, because it has food factories in the US. And it's taking over, it's importing goods from throughout the Caribbean. But most significantly, the US wants access to the Panama Canal, okay? So just keep that in mind. Access to the Panama Canal means access to the Philippines and Asia. Okay, side note, keep that in mind. So let's put it all together. Not yet. Cuba has been going through 3 independence wars since 1868. While Puerto Rico becomes a stronghold of Spanish oppression, Cuba is at war against Spain. The more Cuba is independent, the more Spain holds on to Puerto Rico. So Cuban fighting for independence, Spanish repression of Puerto Ricans, okay? Okay, now let's put all this together. Cuba is about to get its independence in 1897. The United States does not like that because it would lose its sugar interest in Cuba. So the United States invades Cuba under the guise of helping Cubans gain independence. Okay? The Cubans are like, we don't need you, but okay, so they come. The United States then negotiates with Spain, not with Puerto Rico, not with Cuba. The United States and Spain negotiate a peace treaty in 1898 called the Treaty of Paris. That peace treaty Spain cedes, le da, to the United States, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So as a result of the US intervention in Cuba, the United States emerges with overseas territories, which is great for the United States. It's a rational choice. So now it has Puerto Rico, a sugar island, Cuba, a sugar island, 2 strategic posts to get them to the Panama Canal, which they will build, which then gets them to the Philippines. There's another war in the Philippines at this time, which in the long term gives the United States access to Chinese markets. Okay, so Puerto Rico is not an active player here. Puerto Rico has its own independence movements. It has its own individuals. I forgot the name of it. They're blackface. I forgot that, but little revolutionary. Tiznado. I'm going like this, blackface. Tiznados who are trying the best they can to fight against the oppressive Spanish, and who aid the Americans, see Americans as liberators from the evil Spanish. Okay, but Puerto Rico is really a second thought to the U.S. They're like, we want Cuba, and we get Puerto Rico. And then Cuba continues on a path to independence, but American capitalists say, we're not letting go of Puerto Rico. This is a sugar plantation, we're going to invest in it. This is a military outpost, we're going to invest in it. And once we get a hold on it and granted a constitution from the US Congress and deny it political sovereignty, it's ours. Okay? This is a kind of a complicated history that happens in the Caribbean and the Pacific. I teach a class on this, just so that we can look at the Caribbean and the Pacific. Puerto Rico is one of many players in that moment, okay? There were Puerto Ricans opposed to the US invasion. There were Puerto Ricans in support of the US invasion. There were Puerto Rican political leaders were shocked when the US never left, right? In 1900, 1917, they're like, wait a minute, this is not what we signed up for. But the US chose not to leave. And so that's the beginning of 100 years plus of colonial history. So for some people, that's an ugly history. For historians, that's just historical fact. You know, we can paint that in whatever ideological way we want. And we can talk about Spanish nostalgia, about evil or liberatory Americans, about revolutionary or submissive Puerto Ricans. Like, there's a lot of debate. But the facts are that that's what happened, right? Uh-huh.
Do you feel that from a long-term perspective, with the combination of the debt crisis of Puerto Rico and opportunist businessmen, that it may threaten the sovereignty and the culture of Puerto Ricans?
Do I think so at that time or long term?
Right now.
Well, I think that's a question for all of us. I mean, I think Puerto Rico, in the 1950s, when we have this new cultural nationalist project, you have generations that are raised with the myth of cultural nationalism, and their children are raised with that myth as well. And that has come to a rude end, I think, with the junta that has come into Puerto Rico. I think I'm not sure who does not see the junta in Puerto Rico right now as explicit colonialism in the interest of U.S. capitalists. I think Puerto Ricans on the islands are the ones who are protesting the most. But I would make a distinction between what's happening now, which is then what happened in 1898, what happened in the 1940s, what then happens in the 1970s, the neoliberalism that comes late. But right now has a longer history, but it's very specific. And the generation in the island now and maybe the ones in the U.S. are the ones that are challenging it as best they can.
I have a question about language.
Yes.
It seems to me that typically migration to the U.S. by different groups has meant kind of giving up the native language. That obviously, it seems to me, has not been the case with Puerto Rico. And my question is whether historians have looked at that as an issue, perhaps having to do with what you call cultural nationalism.
So first I would say that one of our local scholars, Sonia Nieto, is a specialist in the study of language of Puerto Ricans in the United States. But language is at the heart of the debate of Puerto Rican national identities and everything that I've just mentioned. One of the reasons that one of the easiest ways to demonize the U.S. colonialism of the early 20th century is because of the experience of a whole generation of students in schools, in U.S. colonial schools, who were forced to undergo a curriculum that promoted Americanization. So for that generation, it was a very violent process. It's nuanced, it's not as simple as I'm making it sound. But from the very beginning, U.S. occupation meant trying to create what somebody else calls creating tropical Yankees, an education scholar, teaching them English, teaching them U.S. history, denying them their language and their history. That's a very specific moment in U.S. history. The resentment of that has never gone away. So what happens in the 1940s, nor should it. So what happens in the 1940s and 1950s is that Muñoz Marin and others say, we are distinctly Puerto Rican, we will never lose our language. The language is tied to the island, to a specific romanticization of Spanish or Hispanophile heritage. And it's very explicit in opposition to the US Americans who speak English. So the question of the language in Puerto Rico is heightened and politicized. It's about race, identity, and anti-colonialism. But it's also romantic. It assumes that the Spanish colonial past was not one of colonialism, but one of romance and family. Okay, so it's complicated in the 40s and 50s. And so there is a movement on the island to maintain Spanish as the primary language of instruction. And so it goes back and forth, it depends on the political party. In the 1990s, there's all these new legislations that are promoted by the Partido Nuevo Progresista, the PNP, that passes legislations for the island to be bilingual. That says, Puerto Ricans we're gifted in academics and we can speak Spanish and English. And learning English does not mean losing our Spanish heritage. And there's a lot of pushback against that, but that's fought out in the curriculum. For the diasporic community, it varies. But people who study the language of Latinos in the US will note a very significant difference in language retention of Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans. And so while Mexican Americans might abandon Spanish and acquire English at a much more rapid pace, it's for different reasons than Puerto Ricans. Mexicans that come to the United States of certain generations don't always get to go back to where they came from the way Puerto Ricans can, so the connection is very different. And so also Mexican parents who can't go back constantly to their family make a choice and want their students or their children to be immersed and benefit from English language. The Puerto Rican example is very different. I don't think this is for debate, but Puerto Ricans from different generations always try to hold on to their language because they are never separated from the island, right? Because the family is over there. Even if it's very rare for all the family to be in the US. So while people might live in the US, there's a constant connection or imagined connection to the island, and Spanish is part of that family connection. There was one more thing I was going to say. Nevertheless, while that is the ideal to retain Spanish, it is a fact, if you're an education scholar, that the second generation finds it very difficult to maintain full bilingualism and really becomes, by the second generation, English dominant. That is a fact because of the school system, and as hard as parents may try to teach Spanish, the environment in which the children live in the US, English becomes the dominant language. A new conflict emerges then within the Puerto Rican community on the island in the US that says, but if you lose your language, do you lose your identity? Do you lose your history? And if you go back to the island and you're not dominant in Spanish, a lot of situations occur. My argument, Jorge Duani's argument, and others who work in the US is that, and this goes back to your nation question, in the Puerto Rican diaspora has 3-4 generations of people living in it right now. And they live in different parts of the United States. Puerto Rican identity can be varied and heterogeneous. And not everybody is Spanish dominant. I don't think that makes anybody less identified as Puerto Ricans. And I think that we should not discriminate based on language. So that's a lot, but that's where there's a comparison, and it's very political. And intimate, you know.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, sir.
I have argued for many, many years that racism is probably more obnoxious and deeper in Latin America than in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, that goes contrary to what you call the kind of the romantic view of racial harmony in Puerto Rico and the rest of Latin America. My question has to do with precisely that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any kind of historical analysis and consensus on that phenomenon being generalized to Latin America or just Puerto Rico, as you say?
No. So I would say that while I acknowledge that there's a myth of racial harmony, I call it a myth of racial harmony. I don't disagree with you that discrimination, racial discrimination, is a lived reality in Latin America and the Caribbean. In fact, this semester I'm teaching a class on Afro-Latin America and US Afro-Latinos. So that's a distinction that I would make from the beginning of your statement. And the rest of it, I agree. So Puerto Rico has this idea of racial harmony. It's born in the 1940s and 50s. It's the idea that Puerto Ricans are really a biological product of mixture of Taino heritage, Spanish heritage, and African heritage. It implies racial mixture, which is not the case for everybody. But significantly, it's not just racial mixture, there is a racial hierarchy where whether or not people are mixed, at the top of the hierarchy, it remains Spanish, and at the bottom of the hierarchy, it remains black. By definition, that's a racist understanding of race in Puerto Rico. Okay, now this is not unique to Puerto Rico. This, in Mexico, is called the cosmic race, the mestizo. In Brazil, we have the history of the mulattoes. This version of racial harmony is specific to Latin American countries in the Caribbean, and is born in the 40s and 50s as a way of proudly distinguishing Latin America's history and past from the racist US Americans who lynch, right, in the 1950s and 60s at the height of Jim Crow segregation. So that is a national story and a myth linked to identity. The second part of your comment, I agree with completely. Racism is alive and vibrant in everyday interactions and in education, in healthcare, in housing, in Puerto Rico and everywhere else in Latin America. Latin America, the Caribbean, and the US are societies that were founded on slave labor, that has gone through different processes of emancipation and racial identity formation. That does not deny in any way the very real history of racial discrimination in Latin America. It's hard to say which one is better or worse. Like, it's not, you can't get into a debate of what's better or worse. The debate is, this is what Rodrigo Silva offers us, and Eileen Finley, the first two books that I mentioned, is that there's a spectrum of racist behavior in multiracial Latin American societies. Puerto Rico is on that spectrum, and so is the United States. But nobody, as much as we may want to, historically, the record shows that racism is alive and just functions in different ways, but affects the material reality of people of color in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it can be generalized, but it's also always specific in the nation. And there's a difference between the myth of racial harmony and the reality, the lived reality of blackness or brownness in Latin America and the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico.
But I just don't, I guess I don't see kind of an effort among historians particularly to debunk that myth.
Oh, I see.
It seems so generalized and it's almost taboo to talk about it in Latin America.
Well, so I would disagree a little bit, because what has happened in Latin America since the 1990s, and really this is a movement that began most explicitly in Brazil in the 1970s, is that Afro-Brazilian activists began to challenge the state in terms of census taking and racial categories. And so in Brazil, it's the most explicit, but it also happened in Colombia, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Honduras, and Cuba only recently, again, started to record racial categories. So what's really happened in the 1990s specifically in Latin America and the Caribbean is that activists in all these different countries have worked within their nations, have worked in collaboration with other Latin American nations. And a little detail is that they have worked with international organizations like the UN and others who provide grants and funding and who require racial data to provide grants and funding. There's been a collaboration and a series of international conferences that since the 1990s has turned this around. Academics started to question the myth of racial harmony in the 1970s, in Brazil from the very beginning. But activists, social activists, have done this in the 1990s. And so it's really changed social policy in a lot of countries. To what extent? I dare you to go to Puerto Rico and walk around and say I'm an Afro-Puerto Rican and see what happens to you. There's a lot of resistance to this. There are Puerto Rican activists that are proudly claiming blackness in Puerto Rico. What happens specifically in Puerto Rico, I would say, but you can help me explain this better, is that as soon as someone explicitly says I'm black and I'm Puerto Rican, you're outside of the national imaginary. Obviously, you're using language from the United States. If you're Puerto Rican, you would know that we don't say that. So once you say that, you're outside of the conversation. So once you're outside of the conversation is shut down. So it's, so it requires a lot of discussion, it requires a curriculum. There is another anthropologist scholar, whose name I don't remember right now, who works on the curriculum of race in Puerto Rico, an anti-racist curriculum. So there's movement, but the myth is strong and it's hard to penetrate it. But I think there's a lot of resistance.
I have a question. You said you teach about Afro-Latino.
Uh-huh.
So how would one go about being or identifying with either being African American or Latino?
How would
If
one
not
go
both.
about
Identifying with both.
Yeah. So in the United States, your generation, I suspect, has claimed the identity of Afro-Latinx. Okay. So not just Latino, but Afro-Latino. And not just Latino, but Latinx. And the X means it's a gender neutral term. So it's not Latino, Latina, or it's gender neutral. So it's your generation's movement. And what happens in the US is that to claim an Afro-Latinx identity means I'm asking all Latinos to reevaluate their own identity and their exclusion of blackness within that category. And I'm asking this kind of homogeneous category that we misunderstand as African American to reconsider themselves also, because African Americans cannot deny Afro-Latinos' ethnic identity as Latino. Okay. So that, again, this is an older movement in Latin America and the Caribbean, but for your generation, this is a new identity that people are claiming very specifically. And so the course that I'm teaching is on this long history of Afro-Latin America, but since the 1990s, the US Afro-Latinx experience in the case of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans specifically. So I can send you a copy of my syllabus and I give you some reading examples. It's a process of formation. Oh, of course, the first person that you read is Juan Flores, who I mentioned before for Divided Borders. Juan Flores and his wife, Miriam Jimenez Roman, which I don't know if it's in the bibliography, have a book called The Afro-Latino Reader, published by Duke University Press. And it's like 400, 500 pages. And it's lots of little short primary documents, testimonies, poetry, novels from Latinos in the United States. And they have a very good definition of what Afro-Latino means, what triple consciousness is, what Afro-Latino experiences are like, and it has documentation. And that book includes the Puerto Rican anti-racist statements in the curriculum as well. So I can, if you remind me, I'm happy to send you links and information. But this is, I think, a new kind of dynamic, unapologetic, race-specific, ethnic-specific, gender-neutral movement that's going on in the U.S. Yeah. Sí, señor.
About the language, I kind of have seemed to be going through that because I'm a first generation American, and I have an 18-month-old son. And I kind of, when you spoke about it, I kind of do discriminate against those that don't speak Spanish and kind of say that they are Puerto Rican because I was always taught.
That's right.
From my mother and father that, you know, the language, it's what just identifies you as being Spanish. How can you say you're Spanish if you don't speak the language? So for a long time, and it kind of like dawned on me what you said, but for a long, like right now, my son's mother don't speak Spanish. So I find it as a priority and a responsibility for my son to know Spanish because in some form I feel that if he don't understand the language, like, you know, it's, how can he say that he's Puerto Rican? You know, and, or how can, even though I find it hard sometimes myself speaking Spanish because I was raised in New York and the Spanish sometimes is hard, you know, also, but my primary language is English. Secondary Spanish. I feel more comfortable in English, but I feel it as a sense of identity. I know Spanish. You know, I gotta hold on to this because it's what makes me who I am. You know, I don't know, and thank you for sharing, for speaking about that because I'm gonna look at myself now. You know, when I do know friends who do not speak Spanish and they know more about being Puerto Rican than I do, you know, and it's kind of weird. Yeah, I do.
It's a process, but I would say two quick things. One is that your child will be Puerto Rican because you said your child is Puerto Rican, right? But that means that your definition of Puerto Ricanness has to include your own experience as someone who grew up as a Puerto Rican in New York and someone who has birthed a child in the United States who will carry on your family's history, your understanding of your identity. That's what makes that child Puerto Rican. And you can choose to kind of maintain those relationships with your family on the island or New York, or if you have a young child, it's very difficult, but it's up to you to create a community of support of Spanish speakers. I don't know if the child will say yes or will reject you at some point, but you know, you're the one who has that responsibility, but it's a challenge. You're literally fighting the everyday reality, which is English language speaking. But to relieve the stress a bit, what Jorge Duani allows us to say is the diaspora community is Puerto Rican as well. And you can choose not to reproduce a bias in your family that looks at your child or that allows your child to look at somebody else as less Puerto Rican because of the language. You want to maintain and develop the language as much as possible, but it's really a struggle. But you know, cultural identities are always fluid and negotiable, and you will decide what's best, and it's not easy. But this is very much at the heart of the Puerto Rican experience. Yeah.
In your experience, I tried to glance at the book last night. Education, the educational system. Is there anything to either debunk or reverse the idea, like for instance, my self-esteem suffers based on the information I'm provided in school. I think less of myself based on the information that's provided in school.
Right.
Is there any information, any thing that can help with the reversal? Because I think that education per se has a way of making me feel inferior. Is there anything in the process that can help, not necessarily me at my age, because, you know, but in the educational system, starting from that point, as they get older, maybe that they can feel, I'm raised in the United States, but Puerto Rico is in my heart. It's always been. I've just been that type of child. But the idea is that lack of information, lack of justifiable education to empowerment.
Okay, so I'll say a couple things. You know, when you're raised on the island or somewhere else, in any other nation, you're part of the majority. The curriculum teaches you your history, and so you have no reason to feel inferior. You're in the center of the world. Your experience is as a person of color, a Spanish-speaking person of Puerto Rican heritage in the United States. If you were in an English language school system, which did not value Puerto Rican history or bilingual education, but you still cultivate in others a Puerto Rican identity, that is as a result of your effort and should be lauded, because in spite of an education that was oppressive and denied your history, you still have emerged with that identity. So that should be applauded. Your question is there a curriculum that we can apply? Is there a course for age appropriate, you know, at different levels that we can teach in schools or community centers at different educational stages that advocates for Puerto Rican history? I suspect, yes, I would turn this over to my education scholar friends. I'm a historian, and I don't know enough about the curriculum, although I wrote a book about schools, and I'll tell you why it's a little different. So, but number one, I would say that there's a lot of research on the value of what's called ethnic studies. There's a debate about this going on in the US right now. There's a long history of ethnic studies in the US. Students do much better, have higher graduation rates, increased literacy rates, and self-esteem when they're able to read a history or a literature that represents them, their family, and their heritage in a positive way. When you don't have that, you must rely on your community and your parents. But it's a constant struggle. So there must be a curriculum that can be implemented. I don't know enough about that, but we can try to work that out. I think it's unfortunate. My understanding is that that the Holyoke schools have not made space for that. I mean, and that Holyoke schools in particular have denied Spanish language acquisition. The distinction for me, I was raised in the US. I came to the US when I was 8, but my father was a teacher. And as much as I wanted to forget Spanish, when your father's a teacher, you don't have that choice. So, and so I grew up in a community of teachers in Milwaukee and Chicago. And they all raised their kids to speak Spanish, they all went into education, and they all knew Puerto Rican history. So I grew up in a little bubble of happiness and love for Puerto Rican history and language. When I left that space, I realized it was a bubble, that others in the United States are not raised to value, don't have the curriculum to teach them that. Mine is very much a personal experience. But I must insist that if we reach out to education scholars, they must know whether or not there's curriculum that can be applied to age-appropriate groups.
Yeah, following one's thought. I'm sorry, I had something in my ears I couldn't speak. So, I was born, raised, and educated in Puerto Rico. And honestly, when I really learned about my history was when I went in college. Because the United States controls the whole education, and it's not their interest, it's interest for us to know the real history of Puerto Rico, the way we will rebuild. So, and I learned about my history, and I was so upset so much when I went to the University of Puerto Rico, that I was in there. So, and it's really, upsetting and frustrating because the education is really controlling, and we don't know anything about our history until you went to college. Otherwise, forget it. So, and it's really frustrating. So, by coming here and living here, when I said that I am Puerto Rican, they don't believe that I am Puerto Rican. They, I saw that you were Jamaican, I saw that you were Dominican Republic. So no, I am Puerto Rican. And I have to explain them about our history of invasion by Spain, by United States, and then and why the black people like me came late to the United States. So I had to explain about the industrialization, everything, about the migrant come here and work, that were the people that were basically in the mountain. I was living in the coast, have the means to come over here and work. So it's a long process. It is a long process.
Well, I'll say two things to that. One is, as individuals, we carry a burden where we have to explain our whole history to somebody.
But it's so frustrating, but I do it because they need to be educated, you know, and any time that I have the opportunity to educate people, I will do that, you know.
Well, I advocate educating others about, yes, I'm Puerto Rican, I look black, but I'm not from Utuado, I'm from Arroyo, and I'm Puerto Rican, right?
Like everything que Greco, I love
Yes.
it, I don't care.
Now, I will show a bias and say, I'm happy to describe it to anybody. I don't feel that I should have to describe that to my fellow Puerto Ricans. And my experience at the university level in the United States is that a lot of Puerto Ricans were the ones who were asking me if I was Jamaican, not the Americans. So within the Puerto Rican community, we have a lot of work to do about recognition of different regional communities. But what you're speaking to is growing up in Puerto Rico and not learning about certain things until college. That is what we historians call a colonial education. And that's the reality on the island because it's a colonial territory. And so the colonial education is very important. But by the time you get to university faculty, that's against the disciplinary norms, so we just teach certain things. Okay, but let me tell you what may be of interest to you. And half of it is a plug for my own book called Negotiating Empire, The History of Schools in Puerto Rico. But the source that really reflects what you're discussing is a book by a scholar who passed away also called Aida Negron de Montilla. I don't know if she published the book originally in Spanish or in English, but she has English.
Yeah.
And she was the big history of education scholar in Puerto Rico, and she really detailed the first 40 years of education in Puerto Rico, the commissioners of education, and the particularities of how to teach English, how to teach U.S. history, how to teach Puerto Rican history as something that was born after the Americans arrived on the island, how to withdraw the history of Puerto Rico from the rest of the Caribbean, right? And how to teach subservience and gratitude for the progress and modernity that is linked to the United States. Okay, I'm not making it up, that's the history, and there's a book that goes step by step and discusses that, and it's a very famous book. Because when you get to university level, especially those who are going to go into education, how do you make, none of it makes sense. There's little cognitive dissonance. What I'm studying here and what I learned doesn't make, how do I explain that? Aida Negron de Montilla's book does that. Okay, where do I come in the scholarship? I'm too far removed from that argument. So my argument is that when Puerto Rican scholars look at the history of education, their focus is on the Americanos. This is what they did. This is what they taught. This is what they denied, et cetera, et cetera. And while all of that is true, and I don't deny that, I advocate for looking at Puerto Rican teachers themselves. Because in fact, those who became teachers in the majority were Puerto Ricans. They were working within a colonial system where literally you could be fired for carrying the Puerto Rican flag, right? It was a colonial system. So there's real limitations on the island about expressing nationalist sentiment. But they did it anyway. And so my book is saying, while I don't deny the history of Americanization, I think we should make space for looking at the history of Puerto Rican teachers, number one. And then I say, but when we look at Puerto Rican teachers, I wish I could say they were all nationalist and racially democratic and non-classist, and but no. Teachers are a special group in Puerto Rican history, but in education in general. And they come with specific class backgrounds and their own ethnic and racial biases. So while we have Puerto Rican teachers in the school system who are fighting colonialism to a certain extent, they're reproducing their own racial and class and gendered biases in the Puerto Rican population. So my teachers who I want to be heroes are not heroes because they're just human beings, and they reproduce what Imposing Decency, the first book I showed, the history of gender and race and class discrimination, is then reproduced from the Puerto Rican teachers. So what do we have in Puerto Rican schools? We have an oppressive U.S. colonialism that denies Puerto Rican history and sovereignty, that extracts the island from its Caribbean history and heritage. Then we have a layer of Puerto Rican teachers who are trying to fight that, but are demonstrating their own biases kind of as a middle class sector. And so it's complicated. It's a complicated history. And then we have the U.S. experience, where there is a humiliation. There's a process of humiliating children who are not English dominant, who have brown and black skin, who are recently migrated, who are of working class and poor background. But then we have teachers who are mediating that in the U.S. schools as well. So education is a phenomenal space too. But we've all lived that experience in many different ways.
What was her name?
Aida Negron de Montilla. Aida Negron de Montilla. So you can always send me an email and I'll send you whatever references. I know that I talk really fast. I can send you a copy of the PowerPoint and I can send you any citations of interest to you. Google me by my name because I just told somebody I forgot all my business cards. But if you Google my name, Amherst College, I'll come up and send me an email.
Okay.
And I'm happy to send you whatever syllabi or whatever names and authors. Yes.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It's been wonderful. I just wanted to mention that Kate Krugmeyer, I'm on the Friends Board here at the library, and Manuel and I have been part of a group, a working group, trying to develop more of a collection here
Excellent.
at the library of materials that people can borrow about Puerto Rican history and culture. We got some grant funding from the Carlos Vega Fund for Social Justice and also from the Friends of the Library. So we are going to, after the event on the 20th, we hope to have enough of those books here to then put them into circulation. So most of the books that you've mentioned will, after the end of October, after the event on the 20th, be available to be borrowed from the library. And we're also very, very interested in hearing from people in the community about what other materials they would like to have. So we're buying a collection to start with, but we would like to continue to expand it in ways that are useful to the community. So you can get in touch with either one of us. I set up an email just for the collection, but also Eileen, I'm sorry, I just missed you, Eileen, who's our history room, and Rachel in the young adult room are also part of that committee. So you can approach any of us with ideas or questions.
Well, I applaud that effort 100%. I really want to say it like a million times over, which is what I wanted to say at the beginning of the talk. Puerto Rican history is huge. There is, in fact, a huge scholarship in English and Spanish. There are multiple topics and time periods from which you can collect readings. People who are historians like myself can help categorize them. But if people who are raised in the US are unaware of how expansive, diverse, engaging Puerto Rican scholarship is, and when you're denied that, you're like literally denied your history, you're denied your identity, you're humiliated as a result of that. But, so I'm here to say it's huge. Well, so, and I'm glad that you are collecting it. I hope that you collect as much as possible. I hope that your community members will borrow as much as possible because it's a wonderful scholarship.
I just wanted to acknowledge and thank you for the generosity of spirit that you've shown tonight, your willingness to share information, with people, sharing syllabuses and sharing contacts. And so thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's really my pleasure. And that's why I remain grateful to Manuel for inviting me, because I have the opportunity to share the information with those who are interested. And it's a privilege on my part, but I really think a responsibility to do that as well. So I'm happy to in any form. So you can, I've disappeared from the computer, but you can Google me and email me at Amherst College. There's only one Solsiree del Moral. If you find somebody else, let me know. Send me an email. I'm happy to help as best I can. Thank you. Thank you.